A billionaire's black driver bears a family birthmark. As DNA results confirm their heritage, what surprising revelation about their shared past will be uncovered? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The January wind whipped between Manhattan skyscrapers as Ethan Caldwell stood at the window of his 45th floor suite at the Four Seasons. His reflection showed a man in his early 40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of old money and newer success. The merger negotiations had dragged on for 6 hours, and his team of executives still huddled around the conference table behind him, arguing over profit projections and market share calculations. "Mr. Caldwell," his assistant called, "your car is ready downstairs." Ethan gathered his papers, nodding to the executives who barely noticed his departure. In the elevator, he loosened his tie slightly, feeling the tension of the day settle into his shoulders. The merger would secure his company's position in the renewable energy sector, but something felt off about the whole deal. The lobby's marble floors echoed under his leather shoes as he walked toward the entrance. Outside, Jamal Washington, his driver of 3 years, held the door of the black Mercedes open. Jamal's crisp uniform and professional demeanor had always impressed Ethan, but today, something else caught his attention. As Jamal reached for Ethan's briefcase, his sleeve rode up slightly. There, on his right wrist, was a distinctive mark, a crescent-shaped birthmark with a small at its center. Ethan nearly dropped his phone. The mark was identical to the one he'd seen countless times on his father's wrist, on his aunt's ankle, even on his own hip, a genetic quirk that ran in the Caldwell family. "Everything all right, Mr. Caldwell?" Jamal asked, noticing his employer's sudden stillness. Ethan recovered quickly, sliding into the car's leather interior. "Fine, thank you, Jamal." But his mind raced. The birthmark's appearance in his family was well documented. His grandfather had often called it the Caldwell stamp. How could his driver share such a specific genetic marker? Through the privacy glass, Ethan studied Jamal's profile as they navigated Manhattan traffic. His driver was younger, probably in his early 30s, with features that spoke of a mixed heritage. They'd never discussed personal matters beyond basic pleasantries, maintaining the professional distance typical between employer and employee. The traffic light turned red, and Ethan made a decision. "Jamal, could you pull over at the next coffee shop? I could use some caffeine after that meeting." "Of course, sir. There's a good place around the corner." Minutes later, they sat at a small table in a quiet corner of an upscale coffee house. Jamal seemed uncertain about joining his employer, but complied with Ethan's insistence. The steam from their coffees rose between them like a barrier waiting to be broken. "That's an interesting birthmark you have," Ethan said, keeping his tone casual. "On your wrist." Jamal's hand moved unconsciously to cover the mark. "Oh, this? Had it since birth. Family thing, according to my mother." "Your family, they're from New York?" "Originally from Georgia, sir. Small town called Millbrook. Though my mother moved us north when I was young." Jamal's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a wariness that suggested there was more to the story. "Millbrook," Ethan repeated, the name stirring something in his memory. His grandfather had owned property in Georgia, though he rarely spoke of it. "And the birthmark, does anyone else in your family have it?" Jamal's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "My grandmother had one. And my uncle. Is there a reason for these questions, Mr. Caldwell?" The afternoon crowd swelled around them, creating a bubble of privacy in their corner. Ethan considered his next RDS carefully. The possibility forming in his mind seemed impossible given their different backgrounds, yet the birthmark was too specific to ignore. "The mark you have, it's rather distinctive. In fact, it's identical to one that runs in my family. The Caldwell family." The silence that followed felt heavy, with unspoken implications. Jamal set his cup down slowly, his professional demeanor cracking slightly to reveal genuine surprise. "Sir, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Ethan interrupted gently. "But I am curious. Would you mind telling me more about your family history?" Jamal's shoulders tensed. "It's complicated, Mr. Caldwell. Some stories are better left in the past, according to my mother." The evasion only heightened Ethan's curiosity. In his experience, complicated family histories often held the most important truths. Still, he recognized the discomfort in his driver's posture and decided not to push further for now. Of course. I apologize if I've made you uncomfortable. Shall we head back to the office? The drive back was silent, but the air between them had changed. What had started as a normal business day had shifted into something else entirely, the first thread of a mystery that would unravel both their lives. As Jamal dropped him off at his office building, Ethan made a mental note to call his family lawyer. A DNA test would be easy enough to arrange, and while part of him felt foolish for even considering it, another part couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something significant. The birthmark, Millbrook, Jamal's reluctance to discuss his family, pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet understand but felt compelled to solve. Watching the Mercedes pull away from the curb, Ethan touched the spot on his hip where his own birthmark lay hidden beneath layers of expensive fabric. Whatever connection existed between him and Jamal Washington, he intended to uncover it, regardless of the consequences that might follow. At his penthouse that evening, Ethan sat in his home office, staring at the private laboratory's website on his computer screen. The DNA testing service catered to wealthy clients who value discretion, promising results within days rather than weeks. His mouse hovered over the schedule appointment button as he contemplated the implications of what he was about to do. The next morning, a discreet medical technician arrived at his office under the guise of a routine health screening. Ethan had arranged for Jamal to come up to sign some vehicle insurance papers, carefully timing it to coincide with the technician's visit. The collection process was quick, a simple cheek swab for each of them, with Jamal none the wiser about the real purpose of the medical professional's presence. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself distracted during meetings, his mind wandering to the pending results. He caught himself studying Jamal more closely through the rearview mirror, noting features he hadn't paid attention to before, the shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, subtle things that might hint at shared genetics. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon, marked urgent and encrypted. Ethan waited until he was alone in his office, doors locked and phones silenced, before opening the attachment. The medical jargon filled his screen, but his eyes fixed on one particular section. Probability of first-degree cousin relationship, 99.9%. The coffee cup in his hand nearly slipped to the floor. First cousins. The clinical terminology couldn't diminish the weight of this revelation. Somewhere in their family trees, a branch connected their lives in ways neither had imagined. The birthmark hadn't been a coincidence after all. Ethan's first instinct was to call his father, but he stopped himself. The elder Caldwell was in failing health, and this kind of shock might be too much for him. Besides, there was someone else who deserved to know first. Jamal, he spoke into his intercom. Could you come up to my office? Minutes later, Jamal stood before his desk, maintaining his usual professional demeanor. Ethan gestured to the leather chair across from him. Please sit down. What I'm about to tell you might come as a shock. Jamal's expression remained neutral, but his hands gripped the armrests slightly tighter. Is everything all right, Mr. Caldwell? That depends on your definition of all right. Ethan turned his monitor around, showing the test results. The medical screening from last week wasn't routine. It was a DNA test. I had to know if there was a connection between us because of the birthmark. Jamal leaned forward, eyes scanning the document. His professional mask cracked as understanding dawned, color draining from his face. This can't be right. First cousins. The accuracy rate is nearly perfect, Ethan said softly. Our families are connected, Jamal. The question is how. Jamal stood abruptly, pacing the office. My mother, she always said there were things about our family I was better off not knowing. When I asked about my father's side, about the birthmark, she changed the subject. He stopped at the window, staring out at the city skyline. But cousins with the Caldwells? That's unexpected. Ethan supplied. I know, but it explains some things. The birthmark, for one. And you mentioned Millbrook. My grandfather owned property there. My grandmother lived in Millbrook her whole life, Jamal said quietly. Worked for a wealthy family there. She never talked about them, but sometimes, when she'd had a few drinks, she'd get this look in her eyes. He turned back to Ethan. You really had no idea about any of this?
None.
My family's history in Millbrook was never discussed much. My grandfather moved the family north when my father was young, and that period was treated like a closed book. The silence that followed was heavy with questions neither man knew how to ask. Generations of secrets lay between them, buried beneath years of carefully maintained distance between their families. What do you want to do with this information? Jamal finally asked, his voice carefully controlled. Ethan stood, walking around his desk to face his newly discovered cousin directly. I want to understand. Our families shared something. Maybe something painful. Maybe something they thought better forgotten. But we're here now, and this connection exists whether we acknowledge it or not. It could change everything, Jamal warned. Some secrets stay buried for a reason. Or maybe they stay buried because no one's been brave enough to dig them up, Ethan countered. I'm not suggesting we broadcast this to the world, but don't you want to know the truth? About your family? About mine? Jamal's gaze dropped to his birthmark, then back to Ethan. My mother won't like this. She spent years protecting whatever secret this is. Then we start elsewhere. Records, property deeds, old newspapers. Millbrook must have some trace of what connected our families. The sound of the city filtered through the windows as both men considered the path ahead. Their comfortable employer-employee relationship had been irrevocably altered, replaced by something more complicated and potentially volatile. I have some vacation days saved up, Jamal said finally. If you're serious about investigating this. Ethan nodded, understanding the implicit offer. I'll have my assistant clear my schedule for next week. We'll start in Millbrook. As Jamal left the office, Ethan returned to his desk, opening his laptop to book flights to Georgia. The DNA test results glowed on his other screen, scientific proof of a connection that would lead them both into a past their families had tried to forget. Whatever they discovered in Millbrook, one thing was certain. Their lives would never be the same. The Millbrook Public Library stood as a testament to faded grandeur, its red brick facade weathered by decade of southern summers. Ethan and Jamal sat at a wooden table in the archives section, surrounded by old newspapers and town records. They'd arrived in Georgia that morning, checking into separate rooms at the only hotel in town before beginning their search. The library's ancient air conditioning system hummed overhead as they pored over yellowed pages. Ethan had removed his suit jacket, rolling up his sleeves in concession to the humid Georgia heat. Jamal methodically photographed relevant documents with his phone, creating a digital archive of their discoveries. Look at this, Ethan said, sliding a property deed across the table. My grandfather, Theodore Caldwell, purchased 300 acres here in 1945. The land included what used to be the old Maxwell plantation. Jamal leaned forward, studying the document. My grandmother worked as a housekeeper on a plantation. She never mentioned the name, but the timing fits. He pulled out his own phone, scrolling through notes from conversations with his mother. She would have been 17 that year. Their research was interrupted by the arrival of a cardboard box, delivered by an elderly librarian who regarded them with poorly concealed curiosity. These were in deep storage, she explained. Personal papers donated by the Caldwell family before they left town. Nobody's asked to see them in years. Inside the box, they found bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, photographs curling at the edges, and a leather-bound journal. Ethan lifted out a photograph, its sepia tones depicting a group of people standing before a grand colonial house. His grandfather stood in the center, younger than Ethan had ever seen him, and beside him. That's my grandmother, Jamal said quietly, pointing to a young woman at the edge of the photo. Sarah Washington. Her uniform marked her as household staff, but something in her pose, the way she stood near Theodore Caldwell, suggested a familiarity that transcended servant and master. Ethan reached for the journal, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting inside belonged to his grandmother, Eleanor Caldwell. Her entries painted a picture of life in post-war Georgia, but between descriptions of garden parties and social obligations, darker themes emerged. Listen to this. Ethan read aloud. Theodore spends more time at the house than ever, claiming business requires his presence. But I see how he looks at her, how they both pretend not to notice each other when others are present. The situation becomes more dangerous by the day. Jamal's expression tightened. Are you suggesting? There's more, Ethan continued, flipping through pages. Today I confronted him about Sarah. He denied everything, of course, but then spoke of changes coming, of old ways that needed to end. When I reminded him of his position, his responsibilities, he said something I fear I'll never forget. Some responsibilities matter more than others. The air in the archive room felt heavier as implications settled over them. Jamal stood abruptly, pacing between the shelves of old records. My grandmother never married, he said. My mother was raised by her alone. The family story was that her father died before she was born, but he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. Ethan studied the photograph again, noting the resemblance between the young Theodore Caldwell and Jamal's features. The birthmark, he said softly. It follows the male line in our family. This can't be right, Jamal insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. A secret like that in a town like this in that time? It would have destroyed everyone involved, Ethan finished. The Caldwells' social position, your grandmother's safety, my grandparents' marriage. They would have done anything to keep it hidden. Another document caught his eye, partially hidden beneath the journal. It was a bank transfer record, showing regular payments from a Caldwell account to Sarah. Washington, continuing for decades under the guise of household expenses long after she'd stopped working for the family. He provided for them, Ethan realized. Quietly, carefully, but he didn't abandon them entirely. Jamal sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by revelations that rewrote his entire family history. My mother must have known, or at least suspected. It explains why she was so desperate to leave Millbrook, why she never wanted me to ask questions about the past. The question is, Ethan said, carefully returning the documents to their box, what do we do with this information now? Before Jamal could respond, the librarian reappeared, this time with a local newspaper clipping from 1947. You might want to see this, she said, her expression suggesting she'd been listening to their conversation. It's about the fire at the old Caldwell place. The headline read, Tragic fire claims lives, destroys historic home. Below it, a story unfolded about a mysterious blaze that had consumed the plantation house, reportedly started by unknown parties opposed to changing times. The article mentioned no casualties by name, but noted that several people had been forced to leave town in the aftermath. The fire's timing, Jamal said slowly, it coincides with when my grandmother moved to Atlanta, and when your family went north. Ethan nodded grimly. Someone found out about your grandmother and my grandfather. The fire wasn't an accident, it was a warning. Or an opportunity, Jamal suggested. A way to separate them permanently while preserving everyone's reputation. The weight of generational secrets pressed down on both men as they sat among the scattered evidence of their shared past. What had begun as simple curiosity about a birthmark had unveiled a complex web of love, prejudice, and sacrifice that had shaped both their families' destinies. We need to talk to our families, Ethan said finally. They've carried these secrets long enough. Jamal touched the birthmark on his wrist, the physical proof of a connection that could no longer be denied. Some of them won't thank us for digging this up. Maybe not, Ethan agreed. But we owe it to those who sacrificed everything to keep this hidden, and to ourselves. As they packed up the documents, both men knew they had passed a point of no return. The truth they'd uncovered in Millbrook's archives would force both families to confront a past they'd spent decades trying to forget, and perhaps find healing in the process. The motel's neon sign cast an intermittent red glow through Ethan's window as he reviewed their findings from the library. In the adjacent room, he could hear Jamal on the phone with his mother, the muffled conversation occasionally rising in volume before subsiding again. After their discoveries at the library, both men had agreed to extend their stay in Millbrook, knowing there was more to uncover. Morning brought them to Millbrook's historic district, where Victorian homes lined streets shaded by ancient oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. Their destination was the local historical society, housed in a restored antebellum mansion. As they walked up the creaking steps, several elderly residents on the porch stopped their conversations, watching the unlikely pair with undisguised interest. Inside, the society's president, Martha Whitaker, a woman in her 70s with carefully coiffed white hair, examined their business cards with thinly veiled skepticism. "A Caldwell and a Washington," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Now that's a combination I never expected to see in my lifetime." "We're researching our family histories," Ethan explained, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the woman's obvious discomfort. "We understand both our families have deep roots in Millbrook." Martha's lips tightened. "Deep and tangled roots, Mr. Caldwell. Some might say too tangled." She glanced at Jamal, then back to Ethan. "Are you sure you want to disturb what's long been settled?" "With respect, Mrs. Whitaker," Jamal interjected, his voice level but firm, "nothing about our family's history seems settled. We're here to understand the truth, whatever that might be." The tension in the room thickened as other society members gathered in the doorway, drawn by the unusual conversation. An elderly man stepped forward, his cane tapping against the hardwood floor. "Martha, these boys have a right to know. We've kept quiet long enough." Martha sighed, relenting. "Very well, Thomas. Show them the photographs." She turned to Ethan and Jamal. Thomas Henderson was the groundskeeper at the Caldwell estate. He was there the night of the fire. Thomas led them to a back room filled with filing cabinets. As he searched through the files, he spoke quietly. "Your grandfather, Mr. Caldwell, he was a good man. Ahead of his time in many ways. But good intentions don't always protect you from bad consequences." He pulled out a manila envelope, carefully spreading its contents across a table. The photographs inside showed the aftermath of the fire, the blackened skeleton of the plantation house, crowds of onlookers, and police investigators examining the scene. "The official report called it an accident," Thomas continued, "but everyone knew better. Your grandfather had been making changes, Mr. Caldwell, promoting colored staff to management positions, paying equal wages, hosting integrated gatherings after hours. Some folks in town saw it as a threat to their way of life." "And my grandmother?" Jamal asked. "Sarah Washington?" Thomas's expression softened. "Sarah was special to your grandfather, Mr. Caldwell. Everyone who worked at the estate knew it, even if nobody spoke of it. When she started showing signs of being in a delicate condition, rumors spread." Ethan noticed Jamal's hands clenching into fists. "The fire was meant to send a message?" "Several messages," Thomas nodded. "To your grandfather about overstepping social boundaries. To Sarah about knowing her place. To everyone else about what happened when you challenged the natural order." He paused, selecting another photograph. But they didn't count on Theodore Caldwell's response. The photo showed a newspaper clipping announcing the sale of the Caldwell estate and the family's relocation to New York. Beneath it was a deed transferring ownership of several smaller properties to S. Washington and Associates. "Your grandfather made sure Sarah and the other affected staff had means to support themselves," Thomas explained. "He set up trust funds, arranged jobs in Atlanta, used his connections to protect them as best he could from a distance." A commotion from the main room interrupted them, raised voices, and the sound of something shattering. They rushed out to find Martha arguing with an elderly man whose face was flushed with anger. "You have no right showing them those records," the man shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Ethan and Jamal. "Some things are better left in the past." "Mr. Beaumont," Martha began, but the man cut her off. "My daddy died trying to protect this town's values," he spat. "And now you're helping these people dig up dirt on good families?" The room fell silent. Thomas stepped forward, his cane striking the floor deliberately. "Your daddy died because he and his friends set a fire that got out of control, Robert. And now his son wants to perpetuate the same hatred that destroyed so many lives." The confrontation crackled with decades of unspoken tensions. Ethan moved slightly in front of Jamal, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the others in the room. "We're not here to cause trouble," Ethan said firmly. "We're here to understand our family's past." "Your family's past?" Beaumont laughed bitterly. "Boy, you don't know the half of it. Ask Thomas here about the night your grandfather left town. Ask him what really happened to all those documents that went missing from the courthouse." Before anyone could respond, Beaumont stormed out, leaving behind a room heavy with implications and unasked questions. Martha began cleaning up the broken vase while Thomas sank heavily into a chair. "Perhaps," Thomas said quietly, "you boys should come by my house this evening. There are some things that shouldn't be discussed here, where too many ears are listening." Ethan and Jamal exchanged glances, knowing they were on the verge of uncovering even deeper secrets. Their presence in Millbrook had stirred up more than just old memories. It had awakened long-buried conflicts that threatened to engulf them both. As they left the Historical Society, they could feel the weight of stares from the town's residents. News of their investigation would spread quickly in a community this small, and not everyone would be as helpful as Thomas Henderson. "We're stirring up a hornet's nest," Jamal observed as they walked back to their car. "Maybe," Ethan agreed, "but we've come too far to stop now. Whatever happened the night of that fire, whatever documents Beaumont was talking about, it's all part of our story." They drove back to the motel in silence, each man contemplating the evening ahead and the revelations it might bring. The past they were uncovering was more complex and dangerous than either had imagined, but they were committed to seeing it through, regardless of the consequences. The morning sun had barely touched the Manhattan skyline when Ethan's phone erupted with urgent messages. While he and Jamal had been in Millbrook investigating their family history, Alex Blackwood, CEO of rival energy company Blackwood Industries, had launched a sophisticated attack on Caldwell Enterprises. Ethan sat in his temporary office at the Millbrook Holiday Inn, participating in an emergency video conference with his board of directors. On his laptop screen, faces filled with concern stared back at him. "The rumors are spreading through every major financial publication," his CFO explained, sharing his screen to show headlines from the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times. "Alex is claiming that your recent erratic behavior and questionable family associations make you unfit to lead the company through the upcoming merger." The phrase, "questionable family associations," made Ethan's jaw tighten. Somehow, Alex had learned about his investigation in Millbrook. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. "He's leveraging the uncertainty to approach our major shareholders," another board member added, suggesting that Blackwood Industries could offer a more stable partnership than the merger we've been planning. Ethan muted his microphone and turned to Jamal, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room. "How could Alex have known about our connection so quickly?" "Small towns have long memories and loose lips," Jamal replied, his expression thoughtful. "But the speed of this suggests something else. Someone in Millbrook must have contacted him directly." Unmuting himself, Ethan addressed the board. "What's the shareholders' response been so far?" "Mixed," his CFO answered. "Some are concerned, others are waiting to hear your side. But Alex has called for an emergency shareholders meeting next week. He's pushing for a vote of no confidence." After ending the call, Ethan paced the small room, his mind racing. Years of building Caldwell Enterprises into a leader in renewable energy could unravel because of a family history he was only beginning to understand. Jamal watched him for a moment before speaking. "You know, Mr. Caldwell, Ethan, there might be a way to turn this to your advantage." Ethan stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "Alex is trying to paint our family connection as a liability. But what if we presented it differently?" Jamal pulled out his phone, showing Ethan the Historical Society's records they'd photographed. "Your grandfather didn't just have a relationship with my grandmother. He was actively working to create positive change in a time when that was dangerous. He was ahead of his time in terms of equal employment, fair wages, and integration." Understanding began to dawn on Ethan's face. "You're suggesting we use this history to reshape the narrative?" "Caldwell Enterprises has always promoted itself as a progressive force in energy innovation," Jamal continued. "What if we showed that this commitment to progress and positive change is literally in the company's DNA? That your grandfather's vision of a more equitable future lives on in how you run the company today?" Ethan sat down heavily in the hotel room's chair, considering the implications. It's risky. Bringing these family connections into the open could backfire. More risky than letting Alex control the narrative? Jamal challenged. Right now, he's painting this as a scandal. But what if we owned it? Showed that the Caldwell family has a generations-long commitment to breaking down barriers and driving positive change. Before Ethan could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Henderson. Found more documents in my attic. Letters between your grandfather and local business leaders. You need to see these. Your grandfather didn't just challenge social norms, Jamal said, reading the message over Ethan's shoulder. From what we've learned, he was trying to transform how business was done in the South. That's your heritage, innovation and progress, even in the face of opposition. Ethan began typing rapidly on his laptop. I need to call an emergency press conference. But first, we need to see those letters. If we're going to do this, we need to understand the full story. As they prepared to head to Thomas's house, Ethan's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Alex Blackwood himself. Family secrets have a way of destroying everything they touch. Walk away from the merger now, and this all stays buried. Ethan showed the message to Jamal, who smiled grimly. He's scared. He thought this information would make you retreat, protect the family name. He didn't expect you to embrace it. My grandfather faced down threats and violence to stand by his principles, Ethan said, gathering his coat. I'll be damned if I let Alex Blackwood succeed where those old segregationists failed. As they drove through Millbrook's quiet streets toward Thomas's house, both men understood that their search for family truth had evolved into something larger. The past they were uncovering wouldn't just reshape their understanding of their family, it could determine the future of Caldwell Enterprises and everything Ethan had built. The stakes had risen dramatically, but so had their resolve. Whatever revelations awaited them in Thomas's attic, they would face them together, united by a legacy that was only now coming to light. Thomas Henderson's home sat at the end of a quiet street, its wraparound porch illuminated by a single yellow light. Inside, the elderly man led Ethan and Jamal up a narrow staircase to his attic, the wooden steps creaking under their feet. The space smelled of old paper and cedar, with decades of memories stored in carefully labeled boxes. I've been keeping these safe for nearly 50 years, Thomas explained, pulling out a weathered leather briefcase. Your grandfather gave them to me the night he left town, Ethan. Said I'd know when it was time to pass them on. The briefcase contained a collection of letters, business documents, and a small leather-bound notebook. As they began reviewing the materials, a complex picture emerged of Theodore Caldwell's vision for changing the South's business landscape. These are proposed contracts, Ethan said, examining one document. Partnership agreements between white-owned and black-owned businesses, profit-sharing arrangements, educational funding programs. He looked up at Thomas. This was revolutionary for the 1940s. Your grandfather believed economic equality was the key to social change. Thomas nodded. He was building a network of progressive business leaders, both black and white, who shared his vision. The plantation house wasn't just his home, it was meant to be a meeting place, a center for this new way of doing business. Jamal picked up the notebook, its pages filled with Theodore's precise handwriting. Listen to this. We cannot build a prosperous future on the foundation of prejudice and exclusion. True progress requires equal opportunity, fair compensation, and shared prosperity. Sarah understands this vision better than anyone. Her insights into the community's needs have been invaluable. The mention of Sarah's name caused both men to fall silent. The relationship between their grandparents had clearly been more than just a secret affair. They had been partners in attempting to reshape their society. As they continued reading, Thomas shared his own memories of that time. Your grandfather was trying to establish what he called the Southern Progress Initiative. It would have created a network of integrated businesses with equal ownership and profit sharing between black and white partners. The fire wasn't just about personal relationships. It was meant to stop this economic revolution before it could begin. Ethan thought about his own company's current challenges. This is exactly what Alex is afraid of, that I'll continue my grandfather's legacy of challenging the established order. But you already have, Jamal pointed out. Caldwell Enterprises' focus on renewable energy, your emphasis on diverse hiring practices, your community investment programs. You've been following his blueprint without even knowing it. They spent hours going through the documents, their understanding of their shared history growing deeper. The story that emerged wasn't just about a forbidden love. It was about a vision for social and economic transformation that had been violently suppressed. Around midnight, Ethan found a sealed envelope addressed to my grandchildren. Inside was a letter dated just days before Theodore's death, decades after he'd left Millbrook. To those who come after, if you're reading this, you've begun to uncover the truth about our family's history. The easy path would have been to keep these secrets buried, to let the past remain in darkness. But the Caldwell legacy isn't about taking the easy path. What happened in Millbrook, between your grandmother and me, between our families, between the forces of progress and those of tradition, was more than just a personal story. It was part of a larger struggle for justice and equality that continues to this day. Sarah wasn't just the woman I loved. She was my partner in trying to build a better world. The child we created together, born of love rather than convention, represented the future we dreamed of. I regret many things about those years, but I will never regret loving her or the family we made. To my grandchildren, both Caldwell and Washington, don't let our failure be the end of the dream. What we tried to build in Millbrook is still possible. The walls between people can still come down. The future we imagined can still be created. The truth is your inheritance. Use it wisely. With love and hope, Theodore Caldwell. When Ethan finished reading, the attic was silent except for the sound of rain beginning to fall on the roof. Jamal stood by the small window, his silhouette outlined against the night sky. "What do you think he meant by use it wisely?" Jamal asked finally. Ethan carefully folded the letter. "I think he was telling us that knowing the truth isn't enough. We have to do something with it." He paused, considering. "The Southern Progress Initiative. Maybe it's time to revive it, but on a larger scale, through Caldwell Enterprises." Thomas, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Your grandfather would be proud to see you two working together. But be careful. The same forces that destroyed his dream are still out there, wearing different faces, but carrying the same fears." As they helped Thomas pack up the documents, both men felt the weight of their discovery. They had come looking for family history, but had found something larger, a legacy of courage, vision, and unfinished work that now fell to them to complete. The rain had intensified as they prepared to leave, drumming against the old house's roof, like a distant message from the past. Their journey had started with a birthmark and led them to a mission, one that would require all the courage and conviction their grandparents had shown half a century earlier. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't seen this many people in decades. Ethan and Jamal had organized what they called a family heritage celebration, inviting both the Caldwell and Washington extended families, along with community members. The old basketball court had been transformed with round tables, catering stations, and display boards showing historical photographs and documents that told their shared story. Sarah Chun, Caldwell Enterprises PR director, had flown in from New York to manage the media presence. Local newspapers and even a crew from Atlanta were covering what they dubbed a Southern story of reconciliation. Ethan had carefully choreographed the event to serve both as a family reunion and a public statement about Caldwell Enterprises' commitment to social progress. "The turnout is better than we expected," Jamal observed, watching as people filled the space. Members of both families mingled cautiously, decades of separation slowly giving way to curiosity. Elderly aunts compared family photos on their phones while cousins who had never met discovered shared interests. Ethan nodded, adjusting his tie. "Though not everyone seems happy to be here." He gestured subtly toward a group of older men near the entrance, including Robert Beaumont, their faces set in disapproving frowns. Before either could comment further, the community center's doors burst open. Marcus Washington, Jamal's uncle and a prominent civil rights attorney from Atlanta, strode in. His presence immediately changed the room's energy. Several people who had been chatting comfortably shifted away from each other, old habits reasserting themselves. "So this is the great family reconciliation," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the room. My nephew and his newfound cousin, trying to rewrite history with a party. Jamal moved toward his uncle, but Marcus raised a hand to stop him. No, let me speak. You all want to celebrate this connection? Let's talk about what really happened. Let's talk about how Theodore Caldwell bought my sister's silence with a trust fund. How he promised to change things but ran north when things got tough. The room had gone completely silent. Ethan stepped forward, maintaining his composure. Mr. Washington, we're not here to deny the past or its complexities. We're here to acknowledge the truth and move forward. The truth? Marcus laughed bitterly. You want the truth? Show them the letter I found in my mother's things after she died. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. The one where your grandfather promised to divorce his wife, to acknowledge his child publicly. The one where he swore he'd stay and fight for change. Promises he broke when the fire came. Jamal's mother, Marie Washington, who had been quiet until now, stood up. Marcus, that's enough. You don't know everything that happened that night. I know enough, Marcus retorted. I know our family paid the price for Theodore Caldwell's grand ideas about progress. I know Sarah raised her child alone while the Caldwells lived in luxury in New York. The tension in the room was palpable. Some guests began gathering their things, preparing to leave. But then Thomas Henderson's voice cut through the chaos. You're wrong about Theodore, the old man said, leaning on his cane as he made his way to the center of the room. I was there the night of the fire. I saw what really happened. Theodore didn't run. He was forced out. The same people who set the fire threatened to destroy everything and everyone he cared about if he stayed. Thomas turned to face the crowd. They didn't just threaten him. They threatened Sarah, threatened the child she was carrying, threatened every black family who worked with him. The choice wasn't between staying and running. It was between leaving and watching everyone he loved die. Marcus Washington's expression flickered. And the trust fund? The secret payments? Were arranged through my law firm, a new voice added. Howard Caldwell, Ethan's elderly uncle and family attorney, had been quietly observing until now. Theodore set up a complex network of corporations and trusts, not just for Sarah, but for dozens of families in Millbrook. He couldn't stay, but he made sure everyone affected by his departure was provided for. The revelations landed heavily in the room. Marie Washington walked to her brother, placing a hand on his arm. Marcus, Mama protected you from the worst of it. You were too young to know how dangerous those times were. Theodore did what he could in an impossible situation. As the tension began to ease, Ethan seized the moment. He walked to the center of the room, his presence commanding attention. We're not here to judge the choices our grandparents made in different times. We're here to acknowledge our shared history and to commit to doing better. Caldwell Enterprises is announcing the creation of the Theodore and Sarah Legacy Fund, a $100 million initiative to support minority-owned businesses and educational opportunities in the South. The announcement created a buzz in the room. Even Marcus Washington looked taken aback. But before anyone could respond, Robert Beaumont stepped forward, his face red with anger. You can't buy redemption with corporate money, he spat. Some things can't be fixed with fancy programs and pretty speeches. Some lines weren't meant to be crossed. The confrontation was building toward a crisis point, generations of buried emotions rising to the surface. The carefully planned celebration had become something else entirely, a reckoning with a past that refused to stay buried and a future that remained uncertain. In the midst of the tension, Jamal and Ethan exchanged glances, understanding that their attempt to bridge the divide between their families had unleashed forces beyond their control. The question now was whether they could channel these powerful emotions into something constructive or watch their efforts at reconciliation tear both families apart. In the wake of the tumultuous community gathering, Ethan and Jamal found themselves sitting in Thomas Henderson's living room the following morning. The elderly man had invited them over, sensing they needed guidance after the previous night's revelations. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains that had probably hung there since Thomas's wife was alive, casting intricate patterns on the worn carpet. You both look like you haven't slept, Thomas observed, serving them coffee in delicate china cups that seemed at odds with his weathered hands. But that's to be expected. last night was always going to be difficult. Ethan rubbed his temples, the weight of Marcus Washington's accusations still heavy on his mind. We thought we were prepared for resistance, but the intensity of the emotions, the depth of the pain. We underestimated how raw these wounds still are. Reconciliation isn't a single event, Thomas said, settling into his armchair. It's a process, often a painful one. Your grandfather understood that better than most. He paused, considering his next words carefully. There's someone you should meet, Elizabeth Cooper. She was the midwife who delivered your mother, Jamal. She knows things about that time that even I don't. Jamal leaned forward. She's still alive, 93 years old, and sharp as ever. Lives out on Oak Ridge Road. Thomas's eyes took on a distant look. She was there the night of the fire, and she was there when decisions were made that changed both your families forever. An hour later, their car pulled up to a small white house surrounded by flowering dogwood trees. Elizabeth Cooper sat in a rocking chair on her porch, as if she'd been expecting them. Her small frame belied the strength in her voice as she greeted them. I've been wondering when you boys would find your way to me, she said, gesturing to the empty chairs beside her. Thomas called to say you were coming. It's time you heard the whole story. Elizabeth's account began slowly, like a river finding its course. The night of the fire wasn't just about burning down a house. It was about destroying evidence, documents your grandfather had collected, proof of decades of injustice, records that could have changed things for a lot of families in Millbrook. She rocked gently as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of long-held secrets. Your grandfather, Ethan, he wasn't just trying to acknowledge his relationship with Sarah. He was building a case against some of Millbrook's most powerful families, proof of stolen land, unpaid wages, forged documents. The fire was meant to destroy those records, but they didn't know Theodore had already moved the most important ones. Where? Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He divided them, Elizabeth explained. Some went north with him, some stayed with trusted friends like Thomas, and some... She smiled slightly. Some were hidden in plain sight, woven into the stories mothers told their children, coded into family recipes, hidden in plain letters that seemed to talk about nothing but the weather and local gossip. She turned to Ethan. Your grandfather didn't abandon his vision or his responsibilities. He restructured them. Every trust fund, every secret payment, was part of a larger plan. He was building a network, waiting for the right time, the right generation, to finish what he started. Marcus's letter, Jamal said suddenly. The one where Theodore promised to stay and fight. It wasn't the whole story, was it? Elizabeth shook her head. Sarah knew the letter would be found eventually. It was meant to protect her, to make it look like Theodore had failed her, not that they were working together. The real communication happened through other means. She stood slowly, making her way into the house. When she returned, she carried a weathered recipe box. Your grandmother gave me this to keep safe, Jamal.
Said it would matter someday.
The recipes are real, but look at the margins, the seemingly random markings. Their coordinates, dates, account numbers, a map of everything Theodore put in place. As they began to examine the contents of the recipe box, the full scope of their grandparents' plan began to emerge. Theodore and Sarah hadn't just been lovers caught in an impossible situation. They had been partners in a long-term strategy to document and eventually rectify historical injustices. The question now, Elizabeth said, watching them process this information, is what you'll do with this knowledge. The time your grandparents waited for might finally be here, but that doesn't make the path forward any easier. Ethan and Jamal exchanged glances, understanding that their journey had taken yet another unexpected turn. What had begun as a search for family truth had evolved into something far more significant, a chance to fulfill a vision that had been decades in the making. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elizabeth's porch as they prepared to leave, each man lost in thought about the responsibilities they'd inherited and the challenges that lay ahead. The recipe box sat between them, its contents promising to reshape not just their understanding of the past, but their approach to the future. Your grandparents believed that love could transform society, Elizabeth H. called after them as they walked to their car. But they also knew that love without action, without strategy, without patience, wasn't enough. Remember that as you move forward. The weight of her words followed them down the dusty driveway, adding another layer to their already complex mission. The truth they'd uncovered wasn't just about their family's past, it was a blueprint for the future, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The next morning, Ethan and Jamal gathered in their hotel's conference room, spreading out the contents of Sarah's recipe box across the table. Alongside them lay printouts of Caldwell Enterprises' current community investment programs and the draft proposal for the Theodore and Sarah Legacy Fund. They had spent hours trying to align their grandparents' vision with modern corporate realities. Their work was interrupted by a call from Marie Washington, Jamal's mother. Her voice trembled with excitement as she spoke over the speakerphone. "I found something while cleaning out the attic," she said. "Mama's old diary. I never knew she kept one. It was hidden behind a false wall panel. I'm bringing it to you now." An hour later, Marie arrived, clutching a small, leather-bound book. Her hands shook slightly as she placed it on the table. "I read the first few pages," she admitted. "There's so much I never knew about my own mother." The diary's pages were filled with Sarah Washington's elegant handwriting, the entries spanning from 1945 to 1948. As they began to read, a more intimate picture of the relationship between their grandparents emerged. June 15, 1946, Jamal read aloud. "Theodore showed me the plans today, not just for the business initiative, but for everything. He understands that economic power is the key to real change. The documents we're gathering, the evidence of land theft and exploitation, it's all part of a larger strategy. He calls it playing the long game. We may not see the changes we dream of, but we're laying the groundwork for future generations." Ethan found another significant entry. August 3, 1946. T has established contact with civil rights lawyers in Atlanta and Chicago. The trusts he's setting up aren't just about providing for our child. They're building a network of resources that can be activated when the time is right. He says we need to think in decades, not years. Each trust connects to others, creating a web of financial relationships that will be nearly impossible to untangle without the key. Marie touched the diary's pages gently. "I remember Mama having meetings with lawyers every few months, but she never explained why. She was always writing in little notebooks, keeping records of something. We assumed it was household accounts." As they continued reading, they discovered that Sarah had been more than just a recipient of Theodore's help. She had been an integral part of his plan, using her position within the Black community to document instances of discrimination, fraud, and theft. Her diary contained coded references to documents hidden throughout Millbrook and beyond. Ethan began taking notes on his laptop. "Look at this entry from September 1946. The recipe for success requires 3 ingredients: patience, preparation, and precise timing. Mix in equal parts and store in multiple locations." It's not actually about cooking, it's instructions for handling the documented evidence they collected. And here, Jamal pointed to another passage. She mentions a family tree with deep roots and hidden branches. She's talking about the network of trusts and corporations your grandfather established. Each branch represents a different family affected by the land grabs and discrimination. Marie had been quiet, absorbing these revelations about her mother. "All these years," she said softly, "I thought she was just trying to survive, to keep her head down and protect us. But she was fighting in her own way, wasn't she? She was a strategist, it?
Handleplit.
Both our grandparents were. They knew they couldn't win an open battle in their time, so they planted seeds for future change." A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Sarah Chun, the PR director, entered with a concerned expression. "We have a situation," she announced. "Someone leaked details about the Legacy Fund to the press. Alex Blackwood is giving interviews, claiming it's an admission of corporate guilt, an attempt to buy silence about historical wrongs. The shareholders are getting nervous." Before anyone could respond, Jamal's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Found more letters in Mama's things. We need to talk. What they were planning goes beyond Millbrook. This is bigger than just our families." The pieces were coming together, but with each revelation, the stakes grew higher. What had started as a personal journey of discovery was evolving into something that could affect not just their families or Caldwell enterprises, but potentially reshape the understanding of how wealth and power had been accumulated and maintained in the South. Marie picked up her mother's diary again, turning to the final entry. "Remember," she read aloud, "the truth is like water. It finds its way through any crack, wears down the hardest stone, and eventually creates its own path. Our job is to guide its flow, not contain it." The words seemed to hang in the air, a message from the past that felt more relevant with each passing hour. Their grandparents had set events in motion decades ago, counting on future generations to complete their work. Now that time had come, but the path forward was far from clear. In the golden light of a Georgia sunset, the Millbrook Courthouse's grand jury room hosted an unprecedented gathering. Ethan and Jamal had called together representatives from both families, along with key figures from the community. The old oak table that had witnessed decades of legal proceedings now held a different kind of evidence: Sarah's diary, Theodore's letters, the recipe box full of coded messages, and stacks of recently uncovered documents. Howard Caldwell, the family attorney, stood at the head of the table, his weathered hands resting on a leather briefcase that until now had been sealed in his firm's vault. The room fell silent as he spoke. "What we're about to discuss goes beyond family history," he began. "Theodore Caldwell and Sarah Washington created something extraordinary, a detailed record of systematic land appropriation, wage theft, and economic discrimination across 3 states. But they didn't just document injustice, they built a mechanism to address it." He opened the briefcase and removed a thick legal document. This is the full charter of what they called the Southern Restoration Trust. Theodore used his business acumen and Sarah used her community connections to create a network of linked trusts, property holdings, and corporate entities. Every trust fund, every property transfer, every corporate shell company was part of a larger design. Marcus Washington, who had been studying the documents for days, took over the explanation. They weren't just providing for their immediate family. They were secretly buying back stolen property, establishing legal claims, and creating a framework for eventual restitution. The trusts were structured to mature over generations, accumulating resources until the right moment for action. The revelation landed heavily in the room. But before anyone could fully process its implications, the door opened. A man in an expensive suit entered, his presence commanding immediate attention. "I believe I can add something to this discussion," he said. "James Monroe," he introduced himself. "I'm a lawyer representing several estates in Georgia and Alabama. And I'm also Theodore Caldwell's illegitimate son from an earlier relationship." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Ethan stood, studying the newcomer's face. The family resemblance was subtle but undeniable, including the distinctive birthmark visible at his collar. "I've spent years tracking the trust network Theodore and Sarah created," James continued. "My mother was one of the first people they helped, though I didn't understand that until much later. I'm here because the final pieces are falling into place. The trusts are reaching maturity, and decisions need to be made." Howard nodded, pulling out more documents. The combined value of the trust network now exceeds $3 billion. Theodore and Sarah designed it to fund legal challenges, support community development, and restore property to families who can prove their claims. But they left the final decisions about implementation to their descendants. Alex Blackwood burst into the room, flanked by his lawyers. "This is corporate suicide," he announced. "If Caldwell Enterprises acknowledges any connection to historical land theft or discrimination, the legal liability would be astronomical." But Ethan was already shaking his head. "You still don't understand, Alex. This isn't about liability, it's about legacy. About finishing something our grandparents started. About real corporate responsibility." Jamal stepped forward, addressing the room. "They left us a choice. We can keep these truths buried, protect the status quo. Or we can do what they couldn't in their time. Use these resources to create real change, real reconciliation." The next few hours saw intense discussion as the implications became clear. The trust network Theodore and Sarah had created wasn't just about money. It was a carefully constructed legal framework for addressing historical wrongs while protecting both the victims and those willing to make amends. As the sun set and long shadows crept across the courthouse floor, a consensus began to emerge. The Southern Restoration Trust would be activated, but with modern additions. Caldwell Enterprises would take the lead, using its resources and influence to expand the scope of the original plan. Alex made one final attempt to stop it. "The shareholders will never accept this level of risk," he argued. "You'll lose everything." But Ethan stood firm. "Our grandparents took bigger risks with less protection. They trusted us to finish what they started. The shareholders can choose to be part of this transformation or step aside." The meeting concluded with a series of signatures. As people filed out of the courthouse, Ethan and Jamal remained, standing at the windows their grandparents might have looked through decades ago. They knew this day would come, Jamal said quietly. "They built all of this knowing they wouldn't live to see it happen." "They gave us everything we needed," Ethan replied. "The evidence, the legal framework, the resources. But they left the hardest part to us, the choice to act." As they left the courthouse, the weight of their decision felt right. Their journey had started with a birthmark and led them to inherit not just a secret, but a mission. Theodore and Sarah's legacy would live on, not as a hidden shame, but as a force for transformation. The story of the Caldwell and Washington families had come full circle, but in many ways, it was just beginning. The real work of reconciliation and restoration lay ahead, but now they had something their grandparents never had: the freedom to pursue justice openly, together.